From Harvard Divinity School. I'm going to talk today about how we engage the Sikh past in some contemporary advocacy campaigns and try to contextualize it in the broader neoliberal moment. My paper is called Considering Narratives of the Sikh Past in the Neoliberal Present. I am going to read, but I'll try to be as engaging as possible. I'm sorry. On January 4th, 2017, the U.S. Army took a significant step towards lifting the presumptive ban on Sikhs and other religious minorities serving in the U.S. Army with their articles of faith intact. On the books since 1981, the ban prohibited the wearing of beards, unshorn hair, turbans, and religious bracelets, citing concerns about the disturbance beards, turbans, hair, and bracelets would cause to the, quote, obedience, unity, commitment, and esprit de corps vital for the functioning of the Army. Since 1981, observant Sikhs, defined in the talk today simply as Sikhs who maintain unshorn hair and wear a turban, had to submit individual accommodation requests in order to serve in the Army. These requests, long-winded and tedious, required prospective Sikh American soldiers to prove their competence, often by having to demonstrate special skills like medical training, and show that their articles of faith, their turbans and beards, would not disrupt the Army's standards for unit cohesion and uniformity. The January 4th memorandum greatly simplified the accommodation process for the prospective Sikh American soldier. It was widely celebrated as a victory by mainstream Sikh American and religious liberty advocacy organizations who had worked for years to overturn the discriminatory policy. Finally, the Army was taking definitive steps to, quote, let Sikhs serve. So I have three aims for today's talk. So first, I'm going to try to excavate the narrative of the past that was deployed and is continued to be deployed in these advocacy efforts. I'm going to suggest that the campaign to let Sikhs serve is conscripted by the particularities of the contemporary neoliberal moment. So I look at legal documents and publicity materials generated by the campaign to observe the way in which they narrate the past, as opposed to considering their legal argumentation, for example. To argue that this narrative is confined by the future anterior tense of neoliberalism, by which I mean neoliberalism privileges, I'm suggesting, a past that's constructed with an eye towards what will have been. So rather than considering the present in a critical way, neoliberalism, through bracketed selective recognition of difference, here the turban and beard, requires a linear, progressive understanding of the past as already having been overcome. And such narratives of the past look towards a perfected future of the future anterior as the ultimate telos towards which history tends. Second, I'll look at how this selective narrative of the past constructs an exceptional, mythologized male Sikh American soldier as the ideal Sikh American subject and the single historical actor in the Sikh past. I locate the emergence of an exceptional male Sikh American subject as tied up in an eroded mode of citizenship privileged by neoliberalism. And I'm suggesting that under neoliberalism, the name I'm giving the contemporary moment, citizenship and belonging are increasingly defined by sacrifice, and they're dependent upon recognition and the beneficence from an increasingly punitive state. And then third, lastly, I'll close by looking at the art of contemporary Sikh Canadian artist Jagdeep Raina, whose art is concerned to narrate the Sikh experience differently by considering what could have been, or past conditional versus the future anterior, with which to conceive of the global Sikh past. Through his work, I'll propose a reconsideration of the tense and temporality of the Sikh diaspora. His work helps us work towards an articulation of more urgent political demands, which level their critique not at the liberal head of the neoliberal state, but instead at its increasingly punitive body. All right. So the first section is in the exceptional soldier's warrior past. On January 4th, 2017, the same day as that memorandum, the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty posted a video on YouTube entitled "Why There Aren't More Sikhs in the U.S. Military." The video, published immediately after the memo came out that revised the ban that I talked about, serves as a useful point of entry with which to consider how the Sikh American past has been conceptualized by the campaign as a whole. From 1775 until 1981, it's explained, the United States broadly protected the religious liberties of its troops. In 1981, the Army's ban on religious spirits and other articles of faith represented an unprecedented wrinkle in this pristine timeline, resulting in the, quote, near total exclusion of Sikhism, the world's fifth largest religion, from the US Armed Forces. Following this introduction to Sikhism, the video displays a series of images of Sikh soldiers flashing across the screen. So here are just a few screen grabs of the video. So we got this series of images. And it kind of progresses from Guru era art and slowly through into modern day. Here we have Queen Elizabeth and a Sikh man behind her. And I'll keep it here for a bit. And meanwhile, as these images are flashing, the narrator offers a brief history of Sikhs, right? So he refers vaguely to the, quote, early days of the Sikh religion. When Sikhs suffered severe religious persecution, he says, and meanwhile, the Sikhs had to defend themselves and their neighbors, which became a core part of their identity. Since these early days of Sikhism, quote, Sikhs have populated armies worldwide and earned a reputation among the world's best warriors. In a white paper published by the Sikh Coalition and McDermott, Will and Emery, a law firm based in Washington, D.C., a similar history is presented to make the case for the inclusion of Sikhs in the army. Quote, Sikhs have a long and storied history of military service, the paper states, explaining that, quote, for centuries, Sikh soldiers and officers have served in militaries across the globe, fought bravely in wars, and achieved the highest levels of military distinction. The Sikh defeat of the Afghans in the Battle of Attock, a famous military victory of the Sikh Empire, is cited, as is the role of Sikhs in defeating the British in the 1849 Battle of Chillianwala. Eventually, over the course of the British Raj in India, the Sikhs came to be considered, quote, among the sturdiest and trustiest men of the British Army. A large number of Sikhs would fight in the British Army in World War I, the paper continues, and by the end of both World Wars, 83,000 British Sikh soldiers will have lost their lives, with many more wounded. Presented as a linear narrative wherein the participation of Sikhs in various armies is attributed simplistically to something essential in Sikh identity, rather than rooted in complex histories of colonialism, empire, and pathologizing constructions of race and masculinity, this history is oriented, I'm arguing, towards a perfected future of the American nation state, when the time and space-honored warrior nature of the Sikhs will be fully embraced by the United States. Indeed, the inclusion of Sikhs in the US Army would celebrate this warrior past of the Sikh people, and having been, quote, humiliated and pressured to abandon their faith since the 18th century, the, quote, long and storied history of Sikh service, checkered with obstacles, including the most recent 1981 ban, will provide this history with a neat multiracial conclusion. And of course, I just want to say, there's of course this long history of kind of Sikh martial arts, and there is kind of an alternative. I'm not suggesting that the only origin of Sikhs fighting is in empire. Of course, there's a longer history, but that's what I'm concerned with today. The campaign participates in a liberal economy of affirmation and forgetting, selectively and simultaneously affirming and obscuring aspects of the Sikh past, valorizing a history of sacrifice in the service of empire. This selective affirmation and forgetting relies on a single historical actor, the exceptional Sikh American soldier. Both the video and the white paper employ this historical context to undergird an argument for the exceptional nature of the Sikh soldier, loyal, valiant, and traceable through the historical space and time of the Anglo-American imperial order, who should be granted the right to continue this history in service of the US Army. In the video by the Beckett Fund, the progression of images of Sikh soldiers from the founding of the faith to the present is bookended by a video interview with Captain Simarthpal Singh, a Sikh American West Point graduate. Singh, it's explained, grew up as an observant Sikh on the West Coast, fascinated by the life of a soldier. Having heard stories about his great-grandfather who served in World War I, Singh, we are told, was inspired to apply to West Point after high school. Once accepted, Singh had to contend with the army's ban against beards and turbans, and was forced to make the decision to cut his hair and remove his turban, promising himself that he would grow his hair back as soon as possible. After graduating from West Point, completing a master's degree in engineering, undergoing several more years of rigorous training, and ultimately becoming a decorated soldier, Singh filed a request for accommodation with hopes of being able to serve with his articles of faith intact. A protracted legal battle ensued. Captain Singh sued the Department of Defense and was subjected to a host of discriminatory actions, including being singled out for gas mask and helmet testing. In April 2016, Singh received a permanent accommodation to serve with his turban and beard intact. So Singh's image, Singh's video rather, is juxtaposed with kind of static images of Sikh soldiers across the temporal and spatial span of Sikh history. And Singh kind of emerges as representative of the central, exemplary, exceptional single historical actor in the narrative of the Sikh past employed in the campaign. He's hardworking, he's charismatic, he's handsome, he's masculine. At times smiling, at times solemn, he's shown running through a suburban neighborhood, he's tying his turban, he sits in the Gurdwara, he works out in a grey army t-shirt. Other Sikh soldiers are presented similarly. The Sikh American soldier is brave, well integrated into his unit, and able to, quote, achieve the highest levels of military distinction by providing honorable service to his country. Further, the very difference that's regulated by the state, right, the ban is on the turban and the beard, are actually demonstrated to be entirely compatible with the Army's standards of uniformity of unit cohesion. The turban and beard can be tamed, and they are tamed to meet the Army's standards. For example, the Sikh soldier uses only standard issue army cloth for his turban, which is either camouflage printed or plain black. The beard, even when unshorn, is tied to be molded to the soldier's face so that a gas mask might be secured over it. The exceptional Sikh soldier, as exemplified by Singh and a handful of others, is able to meet the Army's requirement that facial hair be neat and conservative without issue. The turban and beard, rather than, quote, interfering with the ability to perform military duties, actually helps to foster uniformity and unit cohesion, as they represent and embody the core Sikh values of equality, justice, and selfless service, which are said also to be the values of the U.S. Army. Conceived in the crucible of late liberalism's future anterior tense and a longer history of colonialism, empire, and racialization, the Sikh American soldier is exceptional in his ability to work hard and achieve at a high level, overcoming all the obstacles that might face him. He's scripted by the demands and constrictions of the neoliberal present. He's constructed as the sacrificial citizen par excellence, who's entrepreneurial, self-sufficient, responsible, and patriotic. So I took out a lot of theory to spare you all, but I want to do a little bit of theory. So it's useful to think about the figure of the Sikh American soldier in the context of kind of two central paradoxes of neoliberalism, which is defined by a state that's theoretically shrinking, but is in fact expanding and increasingly punitive. The neoliberal state can be considered a centaur state whose liberal, permissive head acts beneficently towards corporations and the upper class, concealing its expanding and increasingly punitive, authoritarian, and paternalistic body, which is directed towards the most marginalized. And I'm drawing kind of a parallel between kind of the selective affirmation and forgetting of the past. Similarly, the state itself is selectively affirming and forgetting parts of the polity. So we can think, for example, of the incarceration boom since the end of the 20th century, increasingly murderous policing tactics, etc. This understanding of the state can be understood what scholar Wendy Brown has explained is the devolved governance characteristic of neoliberalism and its attendant retrenchment from the provisions of social goods and services. So since the end of the 20th century, the state has provided less and less to the people. The state is decentered under neoliberalism, but state power does not disappear. It's rerouted and reworked through its punitive body, which incarcerates, maims, and kills, in order to protect the interests of capital. This decentering of the state and devolution of governance constrains the neoliberal subject, eroding citizenship and tying belonging to the nation-state to the economic capacity of the individual. In this context, the individual citizen is meant to be self-sufficient, entrepreneurial, and responsible for contributing both to the well-being of the self and the economic whole of the nation. Brown calls this eroded type of citizenship sacrificial citizenship, wherein the individual is figured as a firm and a member of ever yet larger firms who are free to navigate the market in order to ensure their survival. Like the centaur state, Brown's concept of the sacrificial citizen reveals a central paradox of neoliberalism, which simultaneously claims to increase the capacity for individuals to experience freedom and restrict citizenship by premising belonging on economic productivity and these notions of sacrifice. Indeed, if a neoliberal subject is unable to demonstrate that they're productive sacrificial citizens, the increasingly punitive centaur state rears its body against the subject. Freedom then is restricted by race, gender, and class. It's only available to those who contend with the state's liberal head. Yes. So in a context wherein these new forms of unfreedom emerge and non-military citizen sacrifice is valorized, sacrifice by the everyday citizen is fetishized as constitutive of citizenship and figured as a life-giving process. In order to level an articulate demand of the liberal head of the neoliberal state, then, the Sikh soldier, traced across this global history of the Sikh people as its central actor, must be both legible and palatable to the liberal head of the centaur state. The Sikh American soldier is burdened as the subject of Sikh history with having to demonstrate an exceptional ability to work hard, achieve excellence, and provide both for himself and the larger whole in which he participates, his platoon, the army as a whole, the nation he serves, etc. The Sikh American subject, exemplified by Captain Singh and others, is necessitated and confined by the demands that the exceedingly punitive centaur state makes legible and the mode of citizenship, neoliberalism, privileges. So in conclusion, I wanted to end the talk by looking a little bit at, given I'm arguing that there's a particular tense of neoliberalism that might confine us, but I'm not suggesting that neoliberalism exhausts our potential for creativity. So while I'm arguing that the sacrificial Sikh soldier / subject is rid in these narratives of historical specificity and is confined by a larger discourse in the way he's projected backwards through history and shown to march through the past into a perfected, unrealized, always deferred future, wherein the Sikh will be recognized by the neoliberal state, allowed to labor in its service. I don't want to suggest that's the only subject that's possible. The question remains then of how the past can be wielded and narrated in tenses other than the future anterior, so that critiques may be leveled not at the liberal head of the centaur state, but its punitive body. So how can we identify more complex Sikh subjects from the past who aren't confined to neoliberalism and allow them to guide us towards making more trenchant critiques for justice in the present, ultimately allowing us to imagine a future other than that which is promised or threatened by neoliberalism? What is the tense that allows us to center that which happens in excess of or in spite of neoliberal acts of recognition, so that we might tell and cohere our stories of the past and organize ourselves as a racialized diasporic community differently? So I want to suggest in closing that there's a past conditional temporality that we can engage and make use of that might assist us in stitching together identities that do not rely on and tends towards the construction of a singular historical actor or the unmarked, unracialized sacrificial citizen neoliberalism mythologizes and constructs. In his 2017 piece, Don't Be Afraid to Fall in Love with the Past, Saturated with Strength and Violence, This Is How You Unlearn, Sikh Canadian artist Jagdeep Raina depicts a scene from 1979 of Punjabi Sikh women marching through the streets of Southall, London, in protest of violence perpetuated by the right-wing National Front. Derived from a still of the 1988 documentary I'm British, but the piece is an articulation precisely of a past conditional temporality. The historical actors in the piece are a collective. They're marching together towards the viewer. Raina draws inspiration from fragments of the global Sikh archive, rendering these fragments visually to cultivate memories and knowledge about the experiences of Sikhs across continents. Reina's use of loose washes and agitated mark making, and the way in which he weaves text in his pieces. So you probably can't see, but there's a little bit of red text on the top left that says, "Smash the patriarchy then and now," help to make the women in the piece mobile. They are moving towards the viewer, saturated with strength from the past that has the capacity to help us unlearn into the present. The piece considers then what could have been had these women continued to march through the streets of London, through the streets across continents that the Sikh diaspora has claimed as its own. By depicting a collectivity who is active on its own terms in the past, Reina's depiction of the Sikh past contrasts strikingly with that which we encounter in the publicity materials of the campaign to let Sikhs serve. Certainly, legal documents and publicity materials differ in aim and genre from artwork, but by placing these depictions side by side, I want to suggest that art from the diaspora has a great deal to teach us about how we conceive of our demands of the state, our memories of the past, and our visions for the future. Reina brings to our attention the trauma of displacement, migration, and violence that has not been easily overcome by the warrior Sikh subject who marches through history into an unrealized future, but rather in his art, Reina suggests a temporal pause, a consideration of what could have been and what could be, should we construct new archive. Thank you.